Today we are going to talk about cells and how they interact with their environment. So we talked about organisms can be unicellular, one cell big, or trillions of cell big. And regardless of how many there are, they're still able to interact with their environment and how they maintain homeostasis, the ability to maintain a stable internal environment. So I want you to just ponder this for a minute or so. And I want to explain this a little bit. So in this situation up here, they took a grape, they put it and submerged it in regular water for 3 days, and 3 days later, the grape swelled and became larger. Then they took grape number two, put it into salt water, let it soak for 3 days, and the grape had shriveled. Why would this happen? The answer is it deals with what we're talking about today, and that is our cell membrane controls what comes into and out of the cell. So we'll get to that specific scenario in a little bit. So the cell membrane, also known as the plasma membrane, translates into thin skin. However, within that thin skin, there are ways that the cell membrane can monitor what comes into or out of it. And what does it are molecules called proteins. And there are a variety of different kinds of proteins that will monitor this taking place. So, for example, you might have what we call a channel protein, which has a certain size gap that would allow this size molecule to go through it. You can also have what are called transport proteins, where there might be a receptor that receives a message, it then changes shape, and then will allow it to go through. A receptor protein is also really important when we talk about our immune system and recognizing foreign material, things like viruses and bacteria within our specific immune response. So the cell membrane controls what comes into and out of it by having receptors, by having certain size molecules that will be able to go through for free, if you will, and others that won't. The other main component of the cell membrane is that it's made out of 2 layers of fat. So if you've ever seen in your fridge Italian dressing or maybe some of the other dressings that your parents might use for cooking, oil and water don't get along. They separate. So when you use a dressing, typically you have to shake it up so that it will at least be somewhat even. Well, the reason why that's important for cells is it creates a nice clear boundary between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. So now we talk about the different kinds of transport that can happen within the cell. And there's two categories. The first is what we call passive transport. And passive, if someone's really passive, it just kind of means, oh, lets it go. They're pretty laid back. In this regard, what it means is that it goes from high to low concentrations and it does not require energy. That's what makes it passive. Active is where something goes from a low concentration to a high concentration. And because that is relatively unnatural, that requires energy. We will get to a diagram in just a little bit that explains what is meant by a concentration gradient. But first, let's talk about some other parts of the cell membrane, and that is that the cell membrane is what we call permeable, which means that because of those gaps that we were just talking about, it allows some stuff to go through no problem. For example, things that are small and things that are readily available, but other things that maybe are too big, charged, meaning that they carry like a positive or negative, they want a little bit more control over those things so that the cell remains stable and maintains that homeostasis that we talked about earlier. So things that are allowed to go through for free: oxygen, carbon dioxide, as we mentioned, small molecules, ones that aren't or don't carry a charge, in some cases water molecules. Things that aren't would be larger molecules, so that'd be like sugar, like glucose, water soluble molecules, so that'd be like fats or steroids, and then charged molecules. So here you're seeing like sodium, potassium, hydrogen, calcium, and then also sometimes water molecules are managed as well. So what we mean by concentration gradient is things by nature actually want to be balanced out. So if we look at this diagram, there are no green circles here, and then here there are a bunch of them. And so what we would see is if we were to like fast forward this is we would see even amount of green dots all throughout, as well as even spaces between them. That's if it was allowed to go through what we call equilibrium. So concentration gradient, we kind of give the notation. So if you see this in future references, this will be an H with brackets around it. So that will mean high. And then an L with brackets around it, that means low. So things by nature are going to balance each other out. And that's what we call passive when there's not energy that makes it so. An example would be is if I took a cup of water and I put just a drop of food coloring in it and I waited for an hour, I wouldn't need to mix, stir, shake anything to that cup, and eventually that color would spread out nice and evenly because that dye would want to spread out so. So that word is what we call diffusion, where it's any substance going from an area of high concentration to an area of low, balancing out. So diffusion is a main word. This also happens when we talked about, if your mom is making cinnamon rolls and all of a sudden you can start smelling that from the room. Or let's say we're having chili lunch at school and all of a sudden the hallways start to smell like chili. That's diffusion. Something that's related, but it's got a separate definition, is what's called osmosis. So osmosis is the movement specifically of water still from high concentration to low concentration, and it's through a membrane. So this now goes back to that grape example that I showed you to begin our presentation. So the reason why the grape that's put in salt water shrivels is because the water from inside of that grape is actually being sucked out by the salt because it wants to balance out. The grape that's in regular water gets slightly larger because there might be, for example, some sugars inside of the grape where water wants to balance it out, and thus the grape will swell. So osmosis is very similar to diffusion, but it's through a membrane and it deals with water only. All right, now we get to some ones that deal with cells specifically. So endocytosis. So cyto, remember, deals with cell. Endo means inside. So if you have endocytosis, it means to bring into the cell. And what we're seeing here is that there'll be little receptors on the cell membrane that will receive a message or receive the protein. It will kind of create a little envelope. So this is like picture number 1, this is picture number 2, and it will pinch off and create a vesicle or a circle around that protein. Opposite of endocytosis would be exocytosis. So this is where there is substances that would leave or exit the cell. So for example, let's say that we're releasing a hormone into the bloodstream from our brain. One of our brain cells might release that hormone from its cells into the bloodstream and then cause a reaction to other cells. Here, you're seeing an actual micrograph or a picture of this happening underneath a microscope. All right, and so it could be a hormone, it could be a fat, it could be a protein, it could be a whole bunch of things, but exocytosis, exit the cell. Here's the same illustration showing how this works. The top one is showing how the cell membrane in the Golgi body, where this would come from, is the same cell membrane that would be part of the plasma membrane. So what we call this is getting a little bit above what we want to know, but this is called the endomembrane system, which basically means the membrane that's around the rough ER, the smooth ER, vesicles, Golgi, it's all the same. And here we're seeing that the cell membrane would again pinch off. It is then going to come and maybe dock with the Golgi and then be processed from there. All right, let's look at a couple other examples. Here's that channel diffusion that we talked about. It just means that there's a specific protein within the cell membrane. It's got a certain shape to it. And if it allows it to go through, it does so. It's still high to low, so that's why it gets its name diffusion. And the channel, similar to like a river, might have a channel to it. It allows it to go through with no problem. The tonics, we'll talk about that a little bit with our lab. and it's also mentioned in our textbook, but basically, depending on what type of solution you're putting a cell into, it might cause the cell to shrivel, to stay the same, or to get bigger, depending on what type of solution you're putting it into. Here's another type of diffusion. So again, we're still going from high to low. Facilitate just means to help. So again, this is where there's just a protein that is there to help it along and to make sure, hey, it's got a certain shape to it. So here we're kind of looking for a square. As long as the square fits the shape, it's going to go through. If these particulates were triangular, guess what? You're not going through. If they're circular, guess what? You're not going through. So again, it's just a way for our cell membrane to really control what comes into and out of the cell. All right, then the final one that I want to talk about is one of what we call the active transports. And if you've ever wondered why reflexes happen or why reactions happen, it's because of the sodium-potassium pump. Specifically, this happens within our nerve cells. Without it, our cells would actually kind of be dysfunctional and we wouldn't be able to react very fast to things that happen. So because this is going against the gradient, it's what we call active. So basically what this is saying is that, and I'm just going to use this picture, there are already a bunch of NAs on this side of the cell membrane. Okay, this is our cell membrane right here. So what it's doing is it's pumping even more Na on this side of the cell membrane. Remember, that's unnatural. And because it's unnatural, it costs energy, usually in the form of what we call ATP. But not only is it causing sodium to be imbalanced on this side, it's also adding even more potassiums on this side. So what it does is it not only makes it so that sodium is imbalanced on one side, but also potassium on the other. And so when we do have a reaction, or we do respond, or we interpret a message, so as I'm talking, hopefully you're listening and you're able to say what words I am saying or understand what words I'm saying, you're able to do that really fast because of what we call the sodium-potassium pump. And that is one of our what we call active transports because it's going from low to high. And here's showing it with what we call a nerve cell or a neuron, pumping it from high to low. So when we talk about transport within the cell or outside the cell, we also have to talk about vesicles. And remember, they are the little ship vessels that are going to send stuff all throughout the cells. Receptor proteins, so we have little kind of feelers on the outside of our cells that let us know how to respond. So again, it might be a hormone, it might be a protein that causes a reaction then within the cell. And we'll watch a couple other videos that kind of bring all this together.